Hi everyone, welcome to this video. Thanks for joining again. If this is your first time on the channel, then thank you for supporting the channel. Welcome to the channel. Please consider to subscribe, and the number one rule here is if you have any thoughts or suggestions, then please leave your suggestions or thoughts in the comment. I'll try to respond to everything, and what is especially appreciated are comments, what videos you want to look at next, what content would be helpful, and what questions are open from this video. Let's get right into it. So in this video, we'll talk about approaching the collective unconscious. So to make it clear from the outset, we're arguing here from the perspective of psychoanalyst Carl Jung. So we're arguing from the perspective of psychoanalysis in general, but then more particular from the worldview put forth by the psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung, who was working at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Jung was a psychoanalyst as a student of Freud, was largely influenced by Freud's ideas, but who went beyond them. He proposed something beyond the unconscious, which was in itself a great turn in psychology, right? This proposition that there are forces beyond our control that we are not conscious of, that we don't know, was a, let's say, explication that wasn't made before. It was implicit in other theories and other philosophies, but ever since this turn, the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about our conductance in the world has radically shifted. Jung shifted this further by proposing something known as the collective unconscious. So what we're concerned with in this video is really how to approach this collective unconscious. So how do we deal with this proposition? How do we deal with the presence of the collective unconscious? How do we deal with its, let's say, immanence within ourselves, but at the same time its transcendence as something that is so vastly beyond what we are or what we consider ourselves to be. So that is the sort of the goal of the video. Roughly what we'll be talking about is, first I'll give a brief overview of the structure of the psyche according to Jung, especially this classical Freudian structure and how Jung sort of expanded that with the collective unconscious. We'll then go into the precise nature of the collective unconscious, first as a general phenomena, as a psychic phenomena, let's say, how we experience it, and how it manifests within our everyday lives, and then as a more, let's say, metaphysical phenomenon, as a factor underlying both psychic and physical reality, sort of as an underlying transcendental function. And we'll get into this discussion. I'm not claiming it's a transcendental function yet. We'll have to look at this critically, And finally, we'll get into this question, how to access the collective unconscious based on the premises we put forth in the first two chapters of this video. And then finally, we will conclude our thoughts with some precautions and some very, I think, valuable insights into what we can actually do to sort of approach the unconscious, collective unconscious in specific, and what we can't do. And this is especially, these precautions are based especially on the presence of the ego, and the ego as a factor that's sort of in rivalry with the collective unconscious, if you will, at least in our everyday experience. So tune in, stay tuned in until the end. I think is quite valuable because, and I think this is most important about this channel in general and my attempt to these topics, I'll try to objectively portray topics. I'm not going to try to say, look, this is how you do, you draw a mandala and you're done, there's the collective unconscious, but we have to look at the theory and look at it sort of how it makes sense within its own technicality, and then see how we can work that out within our own lives. And ultimately, I think, and this is a little bit of a cliffhanger, we have to accept our own submission to these forces to some extent and work on that rather on attempting to just sort of fold the ego mechanisms of attempting to make something come true back into this work with the collective. But as I said, we'll go through it chronologically and starting now with a brief layout of the collective unconscious. I'll just have to write down the time for timestamps later. All right, so the structure of the psyche according to Carl Jung. For Jung, as for Freud, the psyche is on the first level split between the ego and the unconscious. So the ego as a sort of standing in here in this simplified proposition for that which we call consciousness is distinct by the characteristics of the ability to consciously recall its contents. So to say, well, I am this, I am that, X, Y, Z, I do this, I like doing that. So those are contents that we think are true of ourselves, right? That's very fundamental. The ego essentially tells a story of that we think, that we take to be us, that we take to be true. Now there's a layer in Jung above that, the persona, which is essentially that which we then display in various situations. So the persona may differ, depending if you're with your partner, if you're with your loved ones, your very close family, or if you're in a public situation, the persona may differ. You can think of the persona to some extent as a mask. A mask you put on. Right now I'm putting on this mask, then I go to the gym, I put on the other mask, then I go to there. So there's a difference in masks that you can choose from. And the ego would be the underlying reality in quotation marks, because the ego fundamentally has no reality. Jung says the ego is the subjective core of the psyche. So it is that which we, let's say, assume, the elements of reality we assume as our own. We integrate into a linear narrative that is coherent, at least as it is portrayed to ourselves. And now you see a distinction that I always like to highlight and comment in other videos between that which perceives, so that which says, oh, the ego is coherent, or the ego seems coherent, and the ego itself. So the ego you already see is not what we are, right? And also not what perceives, right? And those are, again, two distinct things in Jung. So it is quite important here to note that. I would, and this is now my proposition, and I would go as far as saying the ego is not at all, in all its aspect, conscious. There are unconscious components within the ego that function as, let's say, factors, or Jung calls them complexes, pulling and pushing that which is within the ego around, right? But ultimately, if we are very strict, we can say, well, that which is within the ego can be recalled, it can be thought about, it is part of this narrative that we technically can recall. You can think about it, this is maybe a good metaphor, I never thought of this. Think about it as your pictures gallery on your iPhone, your phone, your smartphone. You have your gallery, you scroll through it, you see images, right? That would be your ego. You can technically recall what is there. Once in a while, you find something that's a bit more difficult to recall. It's like, oh, I can't remember what I did that night. Oh, who's this person, But roughly, you can recall everything precisely because it's there, right? And somehow you can fit it within a narrative structure that hangs together and makes sense. It's linear temporarily, and it makes sense. It is coherent, right? Then there is a level of analysis which is not accessible to you. What happened between the pictures, the gaps, how do they hang together? You make that up, right? The ego makes it up. How do they relate to other things? What did you actually feel, right? You can think about this as, let's say you have an image in your gallery, and it's the image of a place that you very much long for, but you don't want to admit this longing to yourself. So then at a later point, you go to this place and you smell the flowers again, and you feel this intense sense of loneliness within you, this intense sense of melancholia, we would say, right? What happened here is that there's an unconscious factor, something being activated within that very moment that was, until that moment, suppressed, right? Now, the point is that it was there before, right? It was there when you looked at the pictures in the gallery. It's just that the ego, with its narrative, was overriding this sentiment, right? It was sort of telling a story where this didn't matter. Very simply exemplified in pain that you feel in your body. I would say, as a younger person, you have pain here and there, maybe you have a headache every couple of days, maybe your wrist starts to hurt when you type the whole day, these kinds of things. And you're like, oh, well, it's not bad. I have a headache. Well, I didn't drink enough water. I'm just going to have a glass. It may just be something else, though. You don't know. But the ego narrates it away. It narrates, if you will, the complexity of reality away. And the complexity of reality functions on the level of the real, and so reality as in that which is properly beyond you. And we have to be very cautious here because it's very difficult to make these, to create this terminology in the Jungian context, you, me, and outside, inside. It doesn't really work at some level of analysis, but here maybe it works. And that which is within you, right? That feeling. So you have the ego then, and you have below that the unconscious, the personal unconscious, which also contains, all the repressed memories, the kind of stuff that you have forgotten. And this is the difference really, I think, to Freud. It contains repressed memories, but it's also just the kind of stuff that you can't really, there's a certain defense against accessing it. And the ego is that which you can remember, recall, as I said, scroll through the gallery of your photo album, right? Now comes the main difference to Freud, and that is the hypothesis of the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is a level, let's say, below the personal unconscious. It is a structure that connects you, in quotation marks again, with all the other yous. And by that I mean, that's maybe a bit misleading, all the other people that exist, all the other psyches, if you will, the other monads that are walking around, kind of, if you want to use Spinozian terminology. So let's get into the question, what is the collective unconscious? Again, I'm writing timestamps down here. The collective unconscious is essentially the fundament of, well, with that we're getting into the next chapter, but we'll go back a step. But the collective unconscious, at defined very briefly for Jung, is the fundament of all reality, physical and psychic reality. Okay, so I think we'll just leave it at that, and we'll talk about it in the next section. On the psychic level, the collective unconscious are those aspects of the psyche that are not yours, if you will. They are historical reminiscence that you're born with, if you will. You're born with them by virtue of being born into the human species. You're born with this body, with this physiology. You're born also with a certain upbringing, although I would say this upbringing, this indexing of certain aspects of your parents and their parents through your parents and your culture, I would say this all functions on the level of the personal unconscious. But now the collective unconscious are really those aspects that are there time and again qua human existence, right? Now, this does not mean that the collective unconscious is rigid. And it also doesn't rigid in the sense of it's unchanging forever. Like a boat that takes a really long time to break because it's so big, stuff in the ego is really simple to change because, like the very small kind of whatever toy boat that you have, really simple to break. The yacht, the personal unconscious, is a bit more difficult to break or to manipulate, right? That's the personal unconscious. And then the collective unconscious would be a massive boat. Like imagine the biggest boat you can imagine. It's really difficult to break, and it takes a lot of energy that cannot be exhibited by a single person, unless the single person is somehow a superhero kind of in strength level. And I'm saying this on purpose because there's a very interesting theory actually in Jung, or a very interesting consequence of some of his work, that the contents of the collective unconscious can actually change over time. But it takes a lot of power, let's say, a lot of energy input to change them. And this can either happen from one person or from a large group of people, but one person rarely if ever occurs, right? So what then is the collective unconscious? So at the first level, the collective unconscious contains a topographical structure of behavior. Now, behavior in quotation marks, because behavior, at the fundamental level, what is behavior, right? If you think about it in this way, and I know I'm brushing over topics, but I don't want this video to be, really long and, so you can comprehensively watch it. Behavior in the end is elicited on some level psychologically. Like I move my arm because I thought about moving my arm, right? And certainly this can be correlated to a drive, right? To my thirst. Although I'm not really thirsty for coffee, but I like the taste of it. Could be a death drive, you know. It's decaf though. But nonetheless, I lift my arm because this movement of lifting has passed through, you know, my brain, or at least my spinal cord. Now, the consequence of this is that patterns of behavior, so physical patterns of behavior, are elicited also by psychical constitution. So this hypothesis of the collective unconscious on the biological level, we're not in metaphysics yet, is proposing that there are certain topographical grid lines, if you will, along which movement or along which behavior, if you will, takes place archetypally. This does not mean that we cannot do something else. We can, certainly, at some level of analysis, but humans are very much prone not to do that. And it is, according to Jung, unnatural, in quotation marks, not to do that, not to move in certain ways. This means the collective unconscious and the archetypes as these topographical grid lines. You can imagine them as shelves on bookshelves, right? Like the one in my background. It's like they're shelves, and content can only be clustered within those shelves, right? And thus behavior can only happen within those shelves. And now you can take something and do something entirely different, but then there is let's say, a lack of resonance between levels of analysis within your psyche and within, let's say, reality as a whole. And this is then what Jung would refer to as the emergence of, he would refer to this as the hubris of the ego. And then later, this would perhaps lead to mental illness, in some extent, to neurosis. Now, there is a level of the collective unconscious that you can think of as complexes. Okay, so you have the archetypes as those shelves, and you can also think of those shelves as aspects of reality, right? One aspect may be, masculinity. Another aspect may be femininity. And as humans, you have, they always exist in polar opposites, according to Jung. And, archetypally, there has been certain behaviors, certain memories within the human memory, within the human collective memory associated with each of those. And those types of behaviors are active through the collective unconscious. They're available to your, let's say, they structure your reality in that way. So if you experience something, if you make a gesture in the physical reality out there, if I walk out my house and let's say a bird flies around, it sees a hedge, it builds a nest, right? So that's a very fundamental level how this archetypal reality functions. And as an entry point, I think this is fine to understand. It's like you see a partner as a human, and you mate with them in a very specific way. This doesn't mean the physical process of mating, i.e. sex, but it means the kind of courtship, the kind of relationship we build, the kind of things that are relevant to it. It's like partnership to us doesn't mean punching each other in the face, typically, right? But it means something else. And so this something else, what it means is, to Jung, at least in part, determined on this collective level. And then the personal unconscious clusters content around these collective cores. Jung calls them complexes. Right. But let's take it a step further and think about the collective unconscious as the underlying force of the physical and psychic reality. Now, I've already mentioned that when you go out I've already given you the bird example. The bird flies in the world and it builds its nest in the hedge. Okay, well, Now you may ask the question, how did this archetype arise? How did this process of the bird building its nest in the hedge first come about? It's a chicken and egg problem, right? Well, not really, because for Jung, the world is fundamentally structured in an acausal manner. It's structured in a manner that is based on correlation, meaningful correlation in the end. And this is sort of the whole synchronicity hypothesis, which we'll get into in other videos. You can look at those. But now, what's very important here is the hedge doesn't have to be first and be there and it's like build a nest. And the bird doesn't have to go and force itself on the hedge and say build a nest. But what instead happens is the hedge and the bird are in some place. The bird has a drive to lay an egg. The hedge has a certain configuration, and those two somehow work together. They somehow correlate, and in this correlative moment, an action occurs. And the same now this is a very simplified and very sort of non-spiritual interpretation. And I'm giving you this interpretation purposefully. You can spin this a lot longer and further if you want to go into the more spiritual direction. But I'm assuming that it's a very good exemplification for viewers that are not, so let's say, that are not, I think it makes the archetypes graspable as a concrete phenomenon. And now, what this means, right, is that the archetypes are present within our psyche as categories, but they're also present within reality. And now the question is, are they present within reality because they're present within the psyche, or are they actually present within reality? Now, this question is quite difficult to address, and I'm going to dodge it here and say it fundamentally doesn't matter as long as you're human that acts as a psyche within a reality that is external, right? But there is an intricate discussion to this, and we can discuss this. If you're interested in discussing this, then leave a comment, and we'll get into this eventually. I hope, if you want to. Now, this means essentially, right? The consequence of this view is that if we look into that which we see, which we perceive, the senses as the sort of gateway to the external, right? Then what is laid out before us is most fundamentally within us, which is the collective. Now, whether it's within us, as in what we see is us, or whether it is that which is at the fundament of us is also at the fundament of what we see, doesn't matter for the moment. It means, however, that there is the same kind of fabric underneath that which we consider as to be us, i.e. our ego, and that which we consider to be physical reality, i.e. the tree and the hedge and whatever there is. Right? I'm looking at a hedge, so it's always the hedge. And I think this is a very profound point in itself for Jung, but this also leads us to the question now, or it gives us the answer, or one answer, the answer I would like to propose to you in this video. How now can we access this collective structure? And the answer is, one answer is, it's right there, right? It is right there within everything we see. And the very important point, I think, here is that because of these correlations, these synchronistic events, which again we have to talk about in more detail in other videos, but because of their occurrence, which is due to the sort of shared underlying reality between physical and psychic realities, and now I should say that synchronistic events are meaningful correlations within the psychic and physical reality, right? Because of those, there is a direct access point for us if we simply learn to look. And so my main response, how can we access the collective unconscious, what does Jung say, is look, right? Learn to see. And this doesn't only mean to see the external reality, yes, also to see the external reality, right? Because you can see things manifest. I mean, this is a very, esoteric claim now, but if you look at the kinds of things that grow in your garden and the time at which they grow, and you look at the inner psychic processes, maybe you'll see a correlation. Look at stuff like, the change of the seasons, with the first moon of the new year, which is the moon in March, right? Their nature awakes again. And perhaps so do you awake again. And in our ego reality, we always live against those natural cycles, right? We always go against, in the winter, we still get up at 6 a.m. and we work and do whatever we have to do. But there are these cycles in which we correlate with that which is external, so to speak, not because we're somehow determining each other, but because there is an underlying reality. It's not that we are more energetic in summer because the sun is up, but it is we're more energetic in summer because there is something going on that's underlying those realities, right? To some extent. Now, looking doesn't only imply this, right? It's not only about, there's a blossom outside, I'm blossoming too. No, it's also about for example, if you have a difficult decision to make, and suddenly you have a day where something breaks, something falls down and it breaks. Maybe that gives you an answer to that decision you're trying to make, right? Perhaps, and I'm not saying that there's some all true answer, if your cup breaks, you shouldn't do X. But I'm saying perhaps that's a gateway to a correlation. Again, look, see, and as we'll conclude in the next section, interpret, right? That's a very important gesture. You always interpret. Now, looking doesn't end in external reality, obviously. Looking, most importantly, takes place within ourselves. For Jung, the Jungian journey is an inward journey. It's a journey within our own dreams, towards our own dreams, towards that which we are, when the ego isn't active, right? So what this means is obviously look and see also at that which happens to you in associations. That's why associations are so important, by the way. Somebody says something, suddenly anger comes up in you. Now, what does this mean, right? Perhaps the archetype of, if you're a man, the archetype of the anima has been evoked. If you're a female, then the archetype of the animus has been evoked. Perhaps there's something triggered by on the level of the word, on the level of content that this person has said. Look also in these instances. Look at yourself. Be very careful in observing your behavior. When are you tired? When are you awake? Why? Always ask these questions and attempt to correlate, not necessarily to find causal effects, but to find correlations, right? And to be sensible also to what's occurring in others, because again, the collective unconscious is a collective phenomenon, right? It's not something that is individual to you, right? An archetype may resonate in us, like I get angry when someone says something, because the archetype of the anima that Jung conceptualizes that has been activated. By the way, if you want to know more about the anima, there's a video linked somewhere to that, or you can find it on the channel. But it's more like it goes further, right? It goes to the extent that you are, through this collective unconscious, literally connected to all of humanity, past, present, and future, right? But present, that means that if you have a dream, it doesn't only concern you, it concerns all of reality and all of humanity on some level. And I think this is a very important takeaway, but we have to be a little bit cautious here, because Jung says, at some point in his work, he says that we can predict the future from our dreams, right? And sure, yeah, dreams give you an access point into the collective unconscious, right? Because the ego is weakened. But this is a very important point. The ego, as I said, always works as an antagonist of this unconscious structure. The ego always attempts to interpret, it attempts to integrate, it attempts to build a structure that is narrated coherently and linearly. Now, what this means is that the ego will always override the structure of the collective unconscious because it is precisely not linear, not coherent, and so on. So, because we're always caught in this interpretation, we have to be very cautious in working with these materials and constantly rupture and alloy, right? The alchemical process. Rupture, alloy, break down, dismember in order to then remember, you know? You break it apart, you put it together, you add something new, you take something away, you do something with it, right? The alchemical phases, right? Burning, the fire, the water, you know, and so on and so forth. So literally, I think the Jungian quest involves a lot of this working through, talking through certainly as well. That's also the Lacanian quest, right? The Freudian Lacanian quest, you know, this talk therapy, but especially working through, getting to know yourself, not only for yourself, because then you're only getting to know your ego, but for that which you're not. Exposing yourself to that which you're not, exposing yourself to situations where you go beyond that which you are, beyond the ego. I think that is very important in terms of the work or the approaches of a collective unconscious. Now, if you're interested in these kinds of things, then consider to subscribe. I'll post a lot of videos about these contents and other videos about other contents related to the topics of psychoanalysis and Carl Jung in specific on this channel. And please let me know in the comments. I'm really interested. Like, what would you like to know? What would you like me to talk about and go into in more depth? What questions remain open? Maybe what criticism do you have? And yeah, thank you very much. And oh, and of course, leave a like, you know. All right, thanks a lot. See you next time.